San Francisco native and attorney Paul Henderson's commitment to public service is duly noted. The newly appointed executive director of San Francisco's Department of Police Accountability comes to the job when most police departments around the nation are under the microscope. I'm Michael Reel, and this is Real Urban News. We conduct a wide-ranging interview with Paul Henderson. Paul Henderson, congratulations on your recent appointment as the Executive Director of the San Francisco Department of Police Accountability.
Thank you.
What a huge title.
It's a big title. There's a lot behind it. I'm really excited about being there, and I'm excited about the opportunities that it presents. So.
Give us the backstory briefly.
Well, the organization has been around since the 80s, and you know, it really is best practices in terms of police oversight to have civilian oversight. And so we are an independent agency that receives, investigates, and makes findings with the police department and with law enforcement about complaints and misconduct. And so it's evolved over the years. What I think is really interesting is that voters and elected officials have continued to increase both the authority and jurisdiction of the agency, and now is a really exciting time to be doing this work. And so my agency is made up mostly of investigators and of lawyers that conduct these investigations and present hearings for accountability with law enforcement. I'm excited about it. I'm excited about it.
If you will, give us just a little bit of your background, because you didn't start off here, but you have been a noted public servant.
I have been in public service almost all of my career. I started off as a prosecutor, and I was a prosecutor for most of my career. I started off at the very bottom. I was just an intern and worked my way up into being a law clerk, being a civil attorney, and then a trial attorney, and then a manager, and ultimately serving as chief in the district attorney's office in San Francisco under then elected district attorney Kamala Harris. So I was her chief for years. And then I left that agency, the district attorney's office, and I served as the mayor's deputy chief of staff focused on public safety in San Francisco. And that's where I was until this position.
You entered this position, executive director of the San Francisco Police Accountability Program. You entered at a significant time in the nation's history. A lot of police departments around the country are inundated with calls of misconduct, inappropriate behavior.
There's been a big shift in recent years, and I think a lot of that shift has been exacerbated by the news and the media and the coverage for information now that we have body cameras, and now that we have cell phones, and now that we have broader conversations that's becoming more inclusive, specifically of disenfranchised communities and communities of color. And I would include immigration communities as well, where people are re-examining their understanding of what they thought policing to be. And so we've seen a spotlight, if you will, on instances and transgressions, a lot of them involving men of color and law enforcement, that ended with very tragic endings. And that's really validated a lot of the conversations that we've been having about policing. And I will just say, you know, policing is a difficult job. These are folks that put their lives on the line and at risk every single day for work. And I think we're talking in a lot of these instances about some very specific bad apples, but the reality and the real question is, what are we doing about those bad apples when they exist? What have we done in the past? What are we doing right now? And what are we going to do in the future? And so I think those conversations are shaping where this country is going in terms of police reform and police accountability.
From the outside looking in, when you talk about and discuss bad apples, when I talk to young men throughout Southern California and throughout the country that look like you and I, the challenge is that why does this continue to happen to African American men?
Yeah.
Are we that threatening? I notice our kids are called men and they're only 16.
Yeah. I mean,
what's the attraction?
I mean, it's certainly not a surprise to anyone in this country that there are race disparities. I think some of the broadest race disparities exist in our criminal justice system, and that includes how folks are treated when they encounter law enforcement agencies. I would say, and I'm not immune or special, I'm certainly no unicorn in this country. I grew up black my whole life. There's a surprise. And even as chief and as prosecutor here in my academic and my career, you know, I faced many of those same realities that other people that look like me have as well. I've been arrested 6 to 8 times for various things throughout my life, including while I was an actual prosecutor in the city where I was working. I think we have to look at a bigger picture about what types of reforms, what types of rules, what types of training can we introduce to law enforcement to address these implicit biases that absolutely exist in a lot of places, and we haven't been talking about them. We haven't been addressing them, and and these aren't simple solutions. I will say that one of the best solutions, though, I think, in terms of addressing these types of reforms, and again, we're talking about subjective and intransigent decisions that get made in every part of the pipeline. Who gets detained? Who gets arrested? How are they treated? How are they sentenced? In all of these evaluations, we see huge spikes of disparity for communities of color. And the way to address that, I think, is to bring broader communities to the table in partnership with elected officials, in partnership with law enforcement agencies to make sure that needs are being met, because at the end of the day, law enforcement agencies are public service agencies. And we should have a voice in what policing looks like, and we should have a voice in evaluating what determines or what defines fairness in those systems. So that's where I think the country is headed. There's a little more than 18,000 law enforcement agencies that exist in this country, and we know that the best practices in terms of oversight and for reform is centered in civilian oversight. And so I think that's the move that's gaining a lot of traction, and a lot of counties, a lot of states, and even the federal government has recognized that those best practices have been outcome determinative and helpful for smaller communities.
What are you doing in your city of San Francisco? Really a melting pot, diverse location.
It's really a very diverse city in terms of thoughts and values. It's not that diverse in terms of race. It's really not in terms of race and communities of color. So, and I'll use the African Americans specifically. African Americans make up 3.9% of the population in San Francisco. But if you look and examine how are African Americans treated in a city like San Francisco, which is not different from a lot of other cities, we make up more than 50% of our jail population. Now, how do we get there? You can't just point and say that this is all the fault of the police. It's not all the fault of our judges. It's not all the fault of prosecutors. There has to be a broader conversation where parties, agencies are all linked together, having bigger conversations to come up with broader solutions that are going to be effective for the entire population. It really, our criminal justice system fails if it's not fair to everyone that encounters it.
In addition to wearing this hat, you also are a legal and news analyst. You participate in that space, and you bring a lot of knowledge and a lot of background to that. How important is it that we have voices like yours in the national media?
I think it's hugely important. I've been appearing on air for about 10 years now. But I was drawn to that work because I do think it's really important that as we talk about issues that affect specifically disenfranchised communities, that we have a voice at that table. And one of the things that frustrated and challenged me when there were things politically that we were talking about, when there were legal things that were being talked about, when there were social things that were being talked about, it was hard for me because I knew what I wanted to hear and see on television, and I didn't hear and see that on television or in the radio or in magazines. And before you start pointing the finger at agencies and networks, I decided, well, let me do what I can do about it. And I was that guy that would write op-eds. I was that guy that would send messages and tweets to agencies saying, why didn't you cover this aspect of it? Why didn't you address it from this perspective? Why did you miss this obvious issue that is different from the approach that you took because you were speaking to a presumptive audience of this, and there's a broader audience out there that you didn't even address these concerns. And so I just feel very strongly that all voices need to be heard, and I feel very strongly that I think it's important that when people are flipping through the channels or they're trying to get their news, that they also receive that perspective from the lens of other communities like my own.
How has social media really changed the landscape of America and how we filter our news?
Well, it's made it personal, right? And so when I see a story or I see something that resonates with me, I can share it to my network of like-minded individuals, and that elevates the conversation and awareness about specific issues in ways that we did not have before. It's no longer one of those things where we are limited to having to share information in a silo at a church or in an NAACP meeting. We can now proliferate our ideas and our voices amongst a broader network as we can, and only limited by the folks that we are connected to on social media. I think that's really important, and it's changed the game and changed the dynamic of advocacy and changed the game in terms of raising awareness to specific issues. And it's coming at a flashpoint when we're having specifically these conversations in this country about disparities that I think is improved by having these smaller conversations. And here's something that I think is really important, because you can't fix what you can't talk about. And when you aren't having these conversations, these things just go on in perpetuity and never get addressed. And it's in the conversations that we come up with solutions.
When we look at, and you brought them up, the NAACP, I'll do a 21st century Black Lives Matter. Is it enough from your perspective that we discuss some of the issues that we're confronted with, or do we need more legislation?
I think it's both. I mean, it's not just the discussions, but I think you absolutely have to have the discussions at a base level just so that people know what the issues are. And then the next steps are, it's not just the legislation. There's also a whole approach that I think involves voting, having your voice heard, but there's also something to be said for rallying. There's something to be said for protests, especially when they're effective and nonviolent, because these are the ways that disenfranchised communities shine the light on many of the disparities that need to be addressed, so that they no longer are swept under the rug. They no longer are ignored. They no longer are isolated in silos specific to unique communities. And I do think that the media plays a big role in that, in terms of what types of stories they're going to cover, what types of stories they're going to present to a broader audience, so that people can know and hear that people are upset about this. And so when you talk about this flashpoint that we're in this country in terms of police reforms, I think a lot of that is based on social media, and a lot of that is based on the media in terms of cases like Trayvon Martin or in Ferguson, or Tamir Rice. These are the kinds of things that I think the average American looks at and doesn't say, oh, who cares? They say, oh, how did we get to this outcome? How could this have happened when these were the facts and these are the circumstances? And these are conversations that I believe have been taking place in communities of color for a long period of time, but now we're seeing actual videotapes. Now we're seeing actual grand jury verdicts. Now we're seeing actual criminal and civil verdicts affirming behavior that seems inconsistent to a broader population. And that's part of the reason why there's so many people at this table talking about reform.
What's your suggestion on the body camera? You mentioned it earlier. Is that a hindrance or is it a help?
I think it's a help for two ways. One, I think when there's good policing, and there's a lot of good policing, it affirms the behaviors of the police in justifying what they saw and what their decisions are in terms of how they encounter folks while they're doing their job. And it also, on the flip side, creates an independent record for folks to use and evaluate, for us to say afterwards, was this effective? Is this what we define policing as, and is this how we want policing defined? I think it's a good thing. So I think body cameras are good overall, and they help both sides to move conversations forward.
What should we as black men do?
I think there's a list. I think we start by having these conversations. I think we have to ask ourselves, and then we ask our sons, our daughters, our families, our neighbors, what do you think about policing? What do you think about reform? What do you think is important? And we have to get beyond, I don't like the police,
sure,
or I love everything the police do. There's a broader discussion there, and there are real issues that we need to work on as a community, as a broader community. And I think that goes beyond a black issue, a white issue, Hispanic issue, Asian issue, whatever, an LGBT issue. It really means that everyone needs to be at the table, and we all need to be participating in those conversations. And now more than ever is the time to have those conversations. We don't have the leadership that I would like to have, sure, from the federal government on many of these issues. And in fact, many of those initiatives are being rolled back, challenged, and questioned, sure, in the current administration. And so what that's doing is forcing, if we want to continue this commitment to leadership in reform, it's forcing that question to advocacy and action at the state level and the community level. So now is the time to bring these issues up at your church. Now is the time to bring these issues up at your conference that, okay, you may be participating in. Now is the time to have conversations at the water cooler, at the game. I'll come help and join those conversations.
Sure, sure.
But these are the conversations we need to be having. And then you need to have smart people around to help shape and focus those conversations into advocacy, to convert these conversations into how can we achieve these goals? Are we even asking our elected officials what their thoughts are on these issues? Because that's how we determine who we vote for. And if you aren't thinking about these issues, you might not be the right person that I want representing, right, me in Congress, mm-hmm, at the state assembly, as mayor, or wherever. This is how it starts, and this is the stuff that I'd like to see more people doing to participate in the conversation.
From a personal perspective,
yeah,
and I know you speak around the country, you obviously have a nice media imprint and presence. What are you telling young people about
My mother's going to appreciate that you said that.
Navigating some of these waters going forward, when, yeah, we oftentimes you think the playing field is level.
Yes.
But in reality, it's not.
It's not. I think we still have a long ways to go. I do have what I would consider a successful career because I'm able to talk about and focus on the things that I feel passionate about.
Sure.
But I don't think that I'm a candle in the wind, mm-hmm, but there's certainly more room in this tent for other people that either look like me or have perspectives similar to mine that have come from disenfranchised communities to be sharing their voices and sharing their perspectives. And, you know, we're not there yet, but we're never going to get there if people aren't demanding it. I think this is why, you know, when we're having these conversations right now about what is fake news, well, what is true news? Mm-hmm. What is authentic news? What do we want to hear, and where do we hear it? I think these are real conversations where the work that you are doing and the work that I'm doing, it's aggregated by communities that want to hear voices like yours or voices like mine speaking to them about issues that either they have opinions about or that they don't have opinions about, just because it affects them, and they want to hear these conversations that oftentimes get ignored or diminished in the broader conversation in media. So that's really important to me.
How important is it that we tell our own stories?
It's absolutely critical. People don't understand when you tell your story or your story is told from the lens of someone else. That doesn't mean that it's not possible, it just makes it harder. And it's unnecessary if we have folks in our own communities that can be telling our stories, and we do. And again, I'm not just talking about African Americans, I'm talking about all communities. And we don't see all communities represented well, or as well as I think they should be represented in this country. You can't turn on the TV and see the diversity that exists right now in this country. We just don't. We still have a lot of work to do. And I think you see that, and you see those issues being raised when we have these award shows. I think you see it when you're watching the news, when you're looking at movies, when you're watching television. We have to do a better job. We have to demand a better job from advertisers, from networks, from newspapers, from magazines, to have more voices that are reflective of a broader audience. And you know, I'm trying to do my little part, but I'm just one person, and you're just one person and one agency. I think we both are very good at what we do, but there needs to be more, and part of expanding that is having communities be accountable and look for those things and demand those things and proliferate those things to each other. For someone to say, like, you know what, I love real urban news. I learned this that I hadn't seen before. I'm going to post this on Facebook. I'm going to send this to my community group. I'm going to start a conversation, and I want to bring Michael in to record this conversation that we're talking about. These are the kinds of things, because I always like to give people like action steps, like what does that look like? I want to do a voters drive and talk about why it's so important to have people vote. And I want to do a forum and talk about which candidates actually speak to these issues that we think are critical, or that I think is critical. I mean, it's that type of advocacy that is motivated by the conversations that you have every day and I have every day. I think it's important, and that's where our future is. It either survives and is successful, or it's marginalized and is diminished because of the apathy and the lack of action that can take place in our communities.
Focused on our future.
That's it. That is it.
Paul Henderson, Executive Director, San Francisco Department of Police Accountability. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.